So Sonichu is Chris Chan's bread and butter. It is the thing that, by and large, made him famous. But it is also, by and large, the sort of it's one of those little cautionary tales about you can love something, but you can love something a little bit too much, and that's actually a really cool way of explaining Sonichu when you think about it. It was the pride and joy of this little 28-year-old man, or 24, or whatever day. We'll get into how long it was exactly, but the thing to note is that this is what made Chris Chan famous before anybody knew anything about him, and it is about as it's the equivalent of somebody who took their fanfiction.net story a little too seriously. And nowhere is that apparent by the fact that Chris sadly wasted 26 years of his life trying to make this work, apart from when he didn't or couldn't. And that's because, well, I don't think you can really make this work. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In fact, I've got a better idea. Whoops. How about we investigate this together? So there we go. And let's get to work, shall we? So, and just to prove that this Chris wants you to take this absolutely seriously, this is no parody. This is a man's life. His failures, his nuances, his fantasies, his warped worldview, proudly displayed for the world on paper and pixels. Reading Sonichu and learning about its author is nothing less than a descent into someone's personal hell, made all the more terrible for the fact that the author intends for the experience to entertain people, that they would purchase it. There is no joy, no fun in quick fill. There is only layer upon layer of horror. A now detailed So Bad It's Horrible entry from the TV Tropes article, aptly describing the experience of reading Sonichu. Now, some of you may be out there thinking that's a little bit much. I promise you, there is no hyperbole. Sonichu is Chris's official life work, his magnum opus, the largest contribution to society and culture. To most, however, it is a poorly drawn and poorly written comic book series about the adventures and trials that befall a fictionalized version of himself and his imaginary friends. Despite starting out as a comic book about the titular character, it quickly, I was going to say quickly, but more instantaneously would be the better word for it, turned into a wish fulfillment outlet for Chris and his depraved fantasies, with Sonichu being a main character in name only, playing second fiddle to Chris's primary Mary Sue's self-insert. Other characters include Rosechu and Chris's many other self-inserts. Now, the actual chronology of events in terms of like Sonichu's conceptualization are a little difficult to follow because there are some sources that claim that Chris came up with like the idea for Sonichu's as far back as 1998, and there's something to be said about Chris officially began working on Sonichu in around March of the year 2000. However, for the purpose of this article, we are going with the 24th of November 2004 as the pinpoint moment of the actual the beginning of the chronology, so to speak, of Sonichu. So, when the comic began on November 2004, it was updated in intermittently throughout the next 15 years. And despite his extreme laziness, it still gets somewhat regular updates to this very day. Chris wanted the series to last anywhere between 75 and 100 issues, although he was in no hurry to accomplish such a feat due to multiple extended hiatuses, culminating in only 14 completed issues, 15 if you count Sonichu issue 13. And considering the content of issue 13, I think it's fair to say you can really probably 12 issues would probably be a better way for it, if you can even call it that. But that's enough of trying to make sense of it, because trust me, we will struggle very quickly to make sense of this. So Let's start, shall we? Curiously, at the start. Chris first drew Sonichu in March of 2000, after being told he could not use a copyrighted character on a class project. So he instead came up with a true and original character, plagiarizing from two of his favorite video games, Sonic the Hedgehog and Pokemon. What's hilarious about this in hindsight is that Chris was told he couldn't use a copyrighted character, so what Chris did was double down and use two copyrighted characters. There's something deeply uh, that's actually quite funny when you think about it like that. Only problem was is that it would have been funnier still if we didn't know what this would lead to. Mm. Anyway, later, or maybe the next day, who knows, Chris would put his web programming skills to task and come up with Quick's Sonichu site, which showcased his various illustrations of his pride and joy. Over time, Chris would draw new characters in his own little universe that were more blatant rip-offs of the source material that he was inspired by, such as Rosechu and Black Sonichu, later named Black. Or Blake, I should say. So Chris would begin to put together a couple of simple single-page or two-page narratives for his growing cast of characters. For a while, many of these comics were actually focused on the adventures of these characters, with no real references to the outside world. This did not last, because over time he would start putting himself into these comic strips, and with dissatisfaction with his own life running wild, this led to Chris using the comic as a coping mechanism in order to achieve a sense of wish fulfillment. Since he was coming up with his story and nothing less, he could team up with his original creations and make things right in his idealized fantasy world. However, this is where things like slowly start unraveling, because the inadvertent shattering of his heart from Sarah Hammer, along with the expulsion from English class and the confrontation with Mary Lee Walsh, provided the impetus for Chris to kickstart the comic series in full force, turning real-life figures that he encountered into citizens and villains for him and his OCs to interact with. The series initially served as a complement to his love quest, as a feeble attempt to link an accomplishment or boost his own self-worth to unsuspecting prey. After all, Sonichu is zapping to the extreme. He is Christian Western Chandler's only son, and the first way past cooler electric hedgehog Pokemon. Sure. And you better get used to hearing that phrase about Sonichu being Chris's son, because it's just about the only son Chris is probably ever going to get. The comic series was originally hosted on the various incarnations of Chris's homepage, as seen in the Wikipedia archive. In 2013, he began to upload the comics as albums on his Facebook page, and he affirmed in 2015, when he picked up the comic again, that this would be the place to find new pages. In September of 2015, he finally began to sell printed and autographed issues on Etsy and Lulu.com. The comic was originally promoted from the now defunct Sonichu business cards, and he has since graduated to flyers. Each new addition to the series proudly sports a "to be continued" disclaimer page. In fact, the comics are not updated with any regular frequency. In the 20 years since the character's creation, Chris has only completed 15 issues, even though he has zero responsibilities and unlimited free time. Chris has claimed that in total, he plans to complete 50 to 100 issues in his lifetime, meaning that he's 15 to 30% of the way there. And even at this moment in time, Chris is, well, next year he'll be turning 45, and it doesn't look as if Chris is any hurry to start picking up and doodling away anytime soon. Meanwhile, Render's Guide to Sonichu. My art speaks for me. I bet it does, Chris. The how-tos and overviews. To start off, The comics don't appear to have a consistent numbering system in place, making it tricky to organize them. For example, the Sonichu series began with issue number 0 instead of issue number 1. Chris also decided to assign one of the books as issue 12-9 to avoid associating his Pony OC Nightstar with the number 13. The book itself was originally going to be called issue 13, with Planet Dolon as the subject matter instead. But despite that, there was an actual issue 13, which makes the numbering for that even more confusing, only for it to be a bunch of vaguely connected ideas brainwashed into Chris by the idea guys with no actual narrative in sight, or even behind. The following entry, issue number 14, was never completed, and was also the second half of Sonichu issue 13. Issue 15, on the other hand, was eventually renamed to Sonichu issue 0 HD, implying that it's a remaster of Sonichu issue 0, despite the fact that it has a completely different plot that mostly rips off the fan comic Rosechew's story. All of the following issues that have been announced to date were never completed, and they share the confusing number scheme, being issues 16, 17, and 82. Compounding the confusion further are the specials, which were numbered separately from the main comics. But considering they have about as much place as, well, anything else that happens in Sonichu, I think you can safely sort of ignore them. Consider them almost like side stories that don't add anything. A bit like the actual whatever the story is supposed to be of this series. Adding on to this baffling number system, Chris uses a bunch of television lingo when referring to his stories. Each issue up to issue 12-9 contained multiple separately numbered episodes and sub-episodes. Due to the incoherent narrative structure, if there even was one at all, of the stories, along with their inconsistent numbering system, readers often lost track of which story happened in which issue. Again, if that sounds a little confusing, well, you have no idea. Honestly, trying to get through this entire thing is an absolute mess, but it somehow gets even worse because there is not only can you not keep track of anything that goes on in story, but you can't even know when one story starts and one ends out of context. So this entire whole thing is completely indecipherable, just like its creator. Anyway, where was I? Along with the inconsistent numbering system, for example, Black Sonichu, now known as Blake, was introduced in episode number 4, which was the 5th story in the overall series and the first story in Sonichu issue 1, which was the second comic in the series. Do you feel like bashing your head against the wall? Thank God I didn't read this when it came out. Actually, that's probably for the best. I was like 6 years old when this came out. Further confounding matters were the sub-episodes about Chris's love quest, which appeared in issues 0 to 4, and again were numbered separately from the main stories. Why these things were included in the comic? Why not just make these as like little mini, like you know how you would sometimes have comic books that would have like side stories like I don't know like Nightcrawler or Nightwing or Batgirl and stuff like that. They could be like Elseworld stories which feature the characters but just put them in different scenarios. Why Chris never thought about doing this, I have no idea. Probably the only way to actually keep things consistent, and although it probably seemed a little bit more work than it needed, I don't understand what Chris's logic was. I really don't. Anyway, after the Idea Guys boss Sonichu issue 0 HD, Chris had also dropped the traditional format of Sonichu. Other than the Twilight Sparkle's secret shipfic folder cards, sometimes adding new lore to the series, The only other work of art he has worked on related to the franchise since then were long, low quality stories which one could mistake for the ramblings of a schizophrenic person, most notably Angelica Rosechew's Christmas Play and Chaos Crystal Control. Issues 0 and number 1 featured Sonichu as the unchallenged star of the series, with Chris as a supporting character also appearing in the backup strips. By issue number 2, the comic had abruptly transitioned to Chris encountering people from his real life in anime battles. Token attempts to tell Sonichu's stories and introduce Sonichu's spin-off characters were made in issue number 3, but all pretense was dropped from 4 to 7 as the series became a vehicle for Chris as the leader of a heroic band of recolors to battle against a college dean, a group of ineffectual security guards, store managers, and later on, internet trolls and other people who dared to make fun of the comic. Originally, it was the most innocent and harmless, being the byproduct of a simple man with a childish imagination. Up until it became an outlet to call out trolls, exploring his depraved sexual desires, and live out his violent revenge fantasies. They're not joking about that. The comic series was presented as if it were a cartoon or anime, which might explain why the comics mimic visual effects that work in an audiovisual context but fail on paper, and was encapsulated into seasons with various episodes or series for our European friends. Sonichu issue 10 was intended to wrap up the first season of Sonichu, which opened up a can of worms as to the current version of the comics. Was Sonichu intended to be a hit action/adventure soap opera on TV show that is broadcast in Quickville, or was it the historical documentation of Chris's and Sonichu's life and times? Perhaps it was destined to be the gospel for the stay-at-home autistic virgin male, hallowed be his name. Either way, it remained unanswered. Whether Chris continues on with the series because he has a vain, misguided belief that some true and honest soul would consider these as storyboards for proper licensing and production. They never will do that, but let's pretend they will, because that doesn't make this any more confusing. Art imitating life. Sensing some criticism for the self-centeredness of his work, Chris wrote himself out of the stories toward the end of Sonichu issue 7, trapping the Chris character in the time void so that the storyline could focus on other characters. Despite this, Sonichu still served as a strong Mary Sue character, as seen in Sonichu fighting 4centgarbage.com in Sonichu issue 8, as well as the clear Sue tendencies of Reginald Sneasel. He returned from the time void at the end of issue 9, giving all non-Chris characters approximately one issue to have the spotlight to themselves, during which they most likely talked about how much they loved Chris and hoped he would just return safely. On the final page of the issue, Chris claimed that he would write himself out of the stories permanently, giving his characters the opportunity to shine on their own. He went back on this promise almost immediately, in fact almost the very moment he made it, so therefore issue number 10 is, well, no surprise to anyone, the most Chris-centric focused issue of the entire series, which included, but amongst many other things, executing 4 people. Yeah, I won't say any more than that, but if you know, you know. Following the theft of the Medallions of Fail by Blanca, Chris immediately released a new comic adapting the theft into his canon and explaining that the true source of his power lay in his amethyst ring. Since this story was necessarily set after Chris escapes from the Time Void, it was deemed a special preview of Sonichu issue 10, despite the fact that Chris had at that point not finished issue 8 or even begun issue 9. So did he just pull this out of his ass? Probably. Chris started issue 11 in December of 2009 and completed Sonichu issue 10 in February of 2010. He produced a revised ending to issue number 10 in October of 2010. After a long, inspirationless lull, he began churning out new pages of issue 11 in September of 2015. The hiatuses. Chris has regularly lost motivation to draw comics throughout the run of the series. Without a single job held for the vast majority of his life, he has all the time in the world and only lacks a drive to create. Along with the abandonment of the Wikipedia in 2010, Sonichu issue 11 was put on hiatus later that year. Chris claimed that the trolls drained his creativity and scared him away from drawing any more Sonichu. Again, whether or not Chris could or just didn't during this time, we'll wait and see. I have not ended Sonichu. I only lost inspiration to draw, thanks to the people online. After 5 years, and they're not joking by the way, 5 years where seemingly not much happened, of Chris sporadically mentioning the possibility of continuing the comic, on the 4th of September 2015, he finally, and we do mean this finally, added new content to Sonichu issue 11. New pages were added later that day. He said that new pages would be added maybe every other week. 27 pages were uploaded in 2015, but these updates were, of course, not to last. No pages were uploaded in 2016. Chris claimed that ADD and dementia was responsible for his inactivity. Also, it might also have something to do with the fact that Chris was facing bankruptcy and spent more of his time playing on his new PlayStation 4. So, yeah, you pick about what the real answer is. In June of 2017, Chris began making regular updates to the comic, completing Sonichu issue 11 that month and Sonichu issue 12 in October. Chris initially announced that Sonichu issue 13 would be an unofficial crossover with Planet Dolan, but was scrapped after he had a falling out with Doobie Doo-Over. So, in its place, Chris announced Sonichu issue 12-9. 12-9 would be based around My Little Pony and featured a new self-insert of his own, revolving almost entirely around ponies. Which is really good if you like that sort of thing. For those who don't, you probably might not. It probably wasn't even worth coming back. Now, partway through the development of 12-9, Chris's work on the comic broke down. Before 12-9 had been completed, Chris began working on Sonichu issue 14, which was to return to the normal Sonichu setting. He soon spilled paint on the first few unfinished pages and sold them on eBay to make a quick buck, presumably scrapping his work once again. Chris apparently still intended to complete issue 14, however. As he announced Sonichu issue 15, the comic was intended as a remake/reboot of the earlier issues. This was derailed again after Chris found out the fan comic Rosechew's Story, which he began to plagiarize instead of making an original story for issue 15. Kind of interesting how the latest issue, it almost harkens back to the beginning of this sorry little adventure by just stealing ideas from other people. Meanwhile, Sonichu issue 15 was put on hold when communications with the idea guys began. These trolls made Chris illustrate their own narrative, which heavily focused on the politically incorrect retcons and genuinely horrible, unfunny things. Several pages were leaked in January of 2018 by the Kiwi Farms users in contact with the idea guys. After months without updates, Chris revealed in May 2018 that he had continued to work on issue 16, but was hesitant to release the newly finished comic now that he had realized the idea guys had such an influence on it. So issue 16 was sent to Patreon supporters in fall of that year. On the 26th of June 2019, Chris uploaded 8 new pages for a new issue of Sonichu designed to be a sequel to issue 16. 2 days later, in a Patreon post, he would renumber issues 14, 15, and 16. Issue 14 would be moved to 16, 16 would be renamed The Awakening of the CPU, aka The Idea Guy's Corruptions, later renamed again to issue 13, and the new issue would be numbered as issue 14. Issue 17, on the other hand, was later revealed to exist, but only its cover had been seen. It appears to be influenced by the idea guys after his stint in jail, for the cover of Sonichu issue 82 was also uploaded onto DeviantArt. Issues 14, 15, 16, and 17 are therefore considered incomplete. Issue 14 was dropped after the idea guys had lost power. Issue 16, or rather its few brown paint covered pages, was sold on eBay, and issues 17 and 82 never went beyond the covers. Out of all of them, only Sonichu issue 15, renamed Zero HD, continued having work done on it, progressing very slowly, mainly being coloured in during some of Chris's live streams. On the 11th of September 2020, when asked what he felt were the best Sonichu issues, he would reply, in no particular order, 0, 12-9, and 15, all of which are origin stories for a self-insert character. Yeah, that's a funny one, that, isn't it? Currently, like all people, Chris was at his most productive when he was motivated. The unfortunate truth is that much of Chris's motivation in earlier years came from trolls and being trolled. He has created hundreds of videos under the influence of trolls. The same could be said for the Sonichu comics as well. While Chris claims that the stress from the trolls prevented him from writing the comics, the opposite is also likely true, that Sonichu issues 8 through 10 were all created during the classic trolling era, and they happen to be some of Chris's longest comics that he ever did, each one around 100 pages long compared to the usual 50 or so page length for the Sonichu comics. After those, Sonichu issue 11 was finished 8 years after it was started, with no content on it relating to the trolls. Much of the content in issue 12-9 is inspired by Jessica Quinn and the idea guys who ostensibly began their mind games with Chris in order to get him to work on the comic more frequently, all of whom were trolls. The idea guys as well were even able to force an entire issue out of Chris on their own, due in no small part to their emotional manipulation and extortion of him. The only outlier of a comic post-classic trolling era is Sonichu issue 12, which was finished in a half a year and had nothing to do with trolls. Chris's motivation to create issue 12 stemmed from his begrudging relationship with the LGBT community. So, yeah, this whole thing about motivation seems a little, skeptical, so to speak. You could argue Chris was only trying to succeed to spite the trolls and to prove people wrong, but that didn't happen, basically. If anything, it exasperated his fixation on the trolls. Simply put, Chris had no real reason to be writing and illustrating new Sonichu comics, which quite bluntly have always been an exercise in boosting his self-esteem rather than in creating a coherent narrative for his own characters. The relative innocence of the Sonichu comics before trolling has long since been lost, and Chris has genuinely been less productive on a creative level than since the ousting of the idea guys. A lack of a long-term relationships has left Chris's motivation for art stagnant while his delusions festered. While it was not impossible for Chris to complete any of his unfinished Sonichu comics, it was unlikelier he would do so without making a change in his life. And anyone that through that they should be that change in his life would quickly learn that trolling Chris is a bad idea. That being said, after considerable time on the back burner, Chris revealed that in 2023 that Sonichu Zero HD, formerly known as issue 15, was still in the works, and in April of the following year. He announced on his Twitter that he had indeed returned to working on his Magnum Opus. Whether he slips back into his old ways, updating at his own pace only, delays production, or stops outright yet again because of any external factors remains to be seen. But as we also mentioned before, considering that Chris spent pretty much the more fruitful parts of his life sporadically doing this, as opposed to, you know, taking it with any degree of, you know, nonchalance, so to speak. Whether or not fatigue will slow him down or whatever comes along, it's probably the end of the road, even if Chris doesn't want to reveal it or not. Now, with that being said, because we're sort of mostly going to go through just like glance more or less of the rest of this, is that the actual canon of Sonichu is mostly just like, one of these days I want to be able to go through like every single comic and like every single story. But the problem is that, well, some of these are like wildly incoherent and, quite frankly, a little absurd in terms of just how do you even get through any of these. And then, of course, there's the special editions and, well, things that, of course, seem to just be more in the way in terms of, well, you can't take these stories seriously. But speaking of not being able to take things too seriously, and as I said at the very beginning of this video, there are technical approved fan fictions. Things that, well, essentially stories that are canon to the Sonichu story or lore, but ones that, how can you actually approve a fanfic? I don't get it. But to be honest, we will do with looking at some of these at another time because, well, that is just another load to get through, and all this the getting trying to talk about Sonichu with any degree of intelligence is very, very difficult. And then there are, of course, the fan fictions. But we'll cover those next time. So in the meantime, I hope all of you guys have learned, and probably, as far as I'm concerned, Chris has what you might like to say raised the bar. Right now, he is a legend. Two things about that, however. First, he is a legend, but only in his own mind. And second, Chris has demonstrated throughout the world how not to create comics. So, we'll see you then.